The modern women's movement in North America dates from 1848, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Coffin Mott, and others called for a women's convention at Seneca Falls, New York. This convention issued a declaration of sentiments for women, patterned after the American colonies' Declaration of Independence. This new declaration demanded full legal equality, full educational and commercial opportunity, equal compensation, the right to collect wages, and the right to vote. Led by Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, the movement spread rapidly and soon extended into Europe. Over the next few decades, women achieved the right to higher education, entrance into trades and professions, a married woman's rights to property, and voting rights in some states. By 1920, American women had the right to vote in national and all-state elections, thanks to the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The women's movement continues to this day. A major figure in the movement during the late 1800s and early 1900s was Charlotte Perkins Gilman, novelist, essayist, editor, and public speaker. Named Charlotte Anna Perkins at birth, Gilman was born in Hartford, Connecticut on July 3, 1860. Her father was Frederick Beecher Perkins, a librarian and magazine editor. Her mother was Mary Fitch Perkins. She was also the grandniece of Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which promoted the abolitionist cause before the Civil War. Between 1860 and 69, Frederick Perkins left the family for extended time periods. During his absences, he sent his daughter educational material to read. However, in 1869, Frederick and Mary were divorced. Charlotte's formal education was uneven, but she did attend the Rhode Island School of Design, which she left before graduating. In 1884, she married Charles Walter Stetson, a fellow artist. However, she did so reluctantly. A year later, she gave birth to Catherine Beecher, her only child. She also began suffering postpartum depression, which led her to consult the Philadelphia neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell. Mitchell advocated what he called the rest cure, or rest treatment. In one of many medical articles, he described the treatment regimen as follows, quote, "For some years I have been using with success certain methods of renewing the vitality of feeble people by a combination of entire rest and excessive feeding, made possible by passive exercise obtained through the steady use of massage and electricity." Unquote. The rest cure did little, if anything, for Charlotte, and in 1888 she left her husband. To recover, she moved temporarily to Pasadena, California, with her daughter and destitute mother, and began writing poetry and short stories. In May 1892, she published her most famous short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, in the New England Magazine. In 1893, just a year later, she published a book of verse entitled In This Our World. A year later, 1894, the Stetsons were divorced. Charles eventually married his ex-wife's closest friend, Grace Ellery Channing. Before the divorce, Charlotte had moved temporarily to San Francisco, where she edited feminist publications. She also assisted in planning the California Women's Congresses of 1894 and 95, and helped to found the Women's Peace Party. In 1895, Charlotte met the social reformer Jane Addams. Addams had founded Hull House in Chicago, Illinois. This place served as a community center for the neighborhood poor and later as a center for social reform activities. Addams invited Charlotte to spend several months at Hull House. Between 1895 and 1900, Charlotte traveled the country, giving speeches and lectures promoting women's rights. During these travels, in 1898, she published a book entitled Women and Economics, her best-known nonfiction work and a feminist manifesto. In this text, she asserted that women's secondary status in society, especially their economic dependence on men, does not result from biological inferiority. Instead, that status arises from culturally enforced behavior. In 1900, Charlotte married George Houghton Gilman, a first cousin, who was 7 years younger than she. This marriage was a happy match, especially since her new husband supported her intense involvement in social reform. In 1904, Gilman published a book entitled Human Work, which endorsed the idea that women should be able to work outside of the home. In the same year, she also toured England, Holland, Germany, Austria, and Hungary. During her visit to England, she met the British dramatist George Bernard Shaw, as well as Sidney and Beatrice Webb, two prominent British socialists. Between 1909 and 1916, Gilman published a monthly journal entitled The Forerunner. She claimed that she wrote nearly all of the journal's articles and that her work therein could have filled 28 long books. In 1911, she published another book, Moving the Mountain. Like her book Human Work, it advocated the right of women to work outside of the home. In the same year, she published a novel, The Crux. This novel is set in a Colorado boarding house, and it suggests that national progress and American expansion depended as much on women and motherhood as on masculine effort. In 1915, Gilman published Herland, a utopian novel about a female society that results in an ideal social order, free of war, conflict, and domination. A year later, she published a companion novel, also utopian in nature, entitled With Her in Our Land. While married, the Gilmans lived in New York City. In 1922, however, they moved briefly to Norwich in southeastern Connecticut. A year later, Gilman published His Religion and Hers, a book asserting that true religion begins by freeing people from the traditional belief that men should dominate society and the home. In 1934, Gilman's husband died suddenly. She herself learned that she was dying of inoperable cancer. A year later, she completed her autobiography, The Living of Charlotte Perkins Gilman. To prevent a lingering and painful death from her disease, on August 17, 1935, in Pasadena, Gilman took her own life by overdosing on chloroform. Carrie Chapman Catt, a fellow feminist, said that Gilman was one of the greatest American women of her time. She was one of those persons who was, Catt said, quote, so constituted as not to fit existing conditions, and in sharp and painful consciousness cried out against them, unquote. At her death, Gilman was 75 years old.